Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Ellis. I am the founder of Justice for the 110, and I am excited to bring you another fascinating interview around the story of my ancestors, the 110 survivors of Clotilda. Today we have author extraordinaire, Nick Tabor. Nick is a freelance journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Magazine, the New Republic, the Washington Post, Oxford American, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. And he is also the author of his first book, Africatown. For those that can see my screen, this is the actual book. I've had the privilege of talking with Nick on a few occasions about what I think is a book that really fills in the gaps and provides some context to the story of the 110, as well as address some of the inconsistencies from the other stories written by the other authors. And he does it in a way where it's told in a story. It's hard in some occasions to take some of this information and tell it in a compelling way, and that's what Nick was able to do. So I am excited, I'm privileged, and I'm honored to have Nick with us. So Nick, how are you today?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Nick's a journalist, so he knows how to answer questions and be short and not elaborate.
I do. Yeah.
But first, let me just say thank you for your time and for meeting with me today. I'm excited, and the reason why is because I mentioned it at the start of the call how I felt like your book fills in the gaps and really does a great job of taking information that may be dull and dry and telling it in a compelling way. I think you did that, and because of that, I wanted to really have you on to elaborate a little bit more, address some of the questions that I've had,
Hmm.
and just learn from you. So
Yeah.
this is a conversation, obviously, and so we can just jump right into it.
Sounds good to me.
Um, just give the audience some background as to who you are and how you kind of came into this particular story.
I will. Yeah. I grew up in Michigan and I worked for newspapers early in my career. Kind of moved around to wherever the jobs were. Um, I always think about this experience I had at a newspaper in Kentucky. I was there for a couple of years because I was also working on a master's degree. And in this town, it's called Hopkinsville. It was like, it was a lot of the social services were lacking. The sidewalks were kind of cracking, and um, the health department was lacking in resources, and um, the libraries were like consistently rated some of the worst libraries in Kentucky. Schools weren't getting much funding, and I realized over time that the reason it was that way was that there were all these independent taxing boards for each of these things that like decided every year whether or not to accept a tax increase to keep up with inflation. This I am going somewhere with this. This is connected, and then because I was there long enough, I got to know enough people, cultivated good sources. I sort of realized that the reason that all these taxing boards were like passing up the passing on the tax increases every year, and everything was becoming impoverished was that the farmers still exercised all this political influence that was sort of out of proportion with their role in the economy. And it was like this invisible power structure that it took me a couple of years of living there to realize that this was that it was there at all, or that it was operating this way. And because I because it wasn't just somebody telling me about it in the abstract, but because I lived there, you know, for so much time and dealt with these things, it was like such a revelation to me to realize this. I feel like I've been chasing those kinds of discoveries in my reporting ever since. It's more thrilling to me than like just getting a scoop. It's like an anthropological question, like how did this place get to be the way it is, and what are the hidden forces at play here? So in 2018, I was working at New York Magazine, and my editor told me that this book Barracoon was coming out. You know, the interviews with that Zora Neale Hurston conducted with Cudjoe Lewis in the late 1920s. She said, "We're going to run an excerpt of this book in the magazine. We'd really like to have another story to go along with it about what became of the descendants of Cudjoe Lewis. So see if you can track down the family." And that took some doing, because the Descendants Association was sort of dormant at that time. The old version of it had, I think, sort of wasn't very active, and it hadn't started up again yet. And so after about 2 weeks, I managed to get Gary Lumbers on the phone. He's one of Cudjoe's great grandsons, and he urged me to write about the neighborhood itself. He said, "I grew up in Plateau in the 60s, and it was this thriving community." And he said, "Now it looks like a war zone, and it's like there's all this factory pollution. They built a highway through the center of town, destroyed the central business district. A lot of people have left." And he was like, "What did they do to it? How did it get to be this way?" I managed to visit later that week, and I happened to be there on a day when, in Africatown, on a day when a law firm was interviewing all these people about cancer cases and their families, because the firm was suing one of the paper companies for pollution. And I interviewed lots of people who had many like horrific stories about cancer cases and their families, family members dying at young ages, people who had survived cancer themselves. And I kept thinking, well, it can't be a coincidence that the community that was founded by survivors of the last slave voyage also became designated this sort of industrial dumping ground for Southwest Alabama. Can't be a coincidence, but I'd like to know exactly how it happened. We could say it's racism. Of course it was, but I thought that if we sort of took a close look at the specific processes that led to this, again, asking that question, what are the hidden forces at play here, and how did this place get to be the way it is, then it would reveal a lot about how environmental racism works everywhere. So it took a year before I realized that this really demanded a book of its own. And at the end of 2019, I was signing a book contract and moving down to Mobile. Left my job in my apartment in New York City and committed to do this full time for a while.
Few follow-ups, and thank you for that. Would you consider yourself an environmental activist, or how would you label, based off of what you share with where you started in Kentucky and then focusing this book on the environmental injustices, how would you kind of characterize yourself and the work that you are doing?
I think of myself as a reporter, I guess, first and foremost, an investigative reporter. And I do write opinionated journalism now. You know, I write for like in this book and in magazine pieces, I do make arguments of my own. But I have to say that I still have a kind of this newspaper reporter's tendency to feel like like I'm a reporter first and foremost, and it's not my job to try to change things. It's my job to just get the information and report it. At a certain point, that does kind of break down. You know, obviously I do want this book to make a difference, but I feel like I'm never going to get over that feeling that like I don't get involved in the story. It's not my job to do advocacy. My job is to report. So
secondly, to follow up, you mentioned on your first day of arrival, you went and was that strategic that arriving on that particular day? Did you know that this was taking place, or was it kind of just,
It was just good timing. I mean, I will say that a lot of people in the community and people associated with the story and the revival of Africatown have often said things like, there's something spiritual happening here. There's a sense that there are a lot of like uncanny coincidences, and that things have in some cases kind of arrayed in this amazing way for the benefit of the descendants and the community, the Africatown community. And I feel like I've felt that in my own life, I guess. I felt like everything aligned perfectly for me to be able to do this. The timing was incredible. I arrived just before the pandemic started. Had I sent out that book proposal 6 months later, I'm sure everything would have been different. It would not have been possible to do the reporting at all. Publishers would have been like, how are you going to do that? You know, there's a lockdown happening. So that was another case of it that it's by apparently some amazing coincidence, I arrived on a day when this law firm had taken over all the space at Yorktown Baptist Church and had kind of collected everybody there for me. Everybody who had these stories to tell about cancer.
So it just sort of happened. It was pomp and circumstance. You kind of characterize yourself more as an investigative journalist. So when you set out to write the book, what were your expectations? And then I'll have a follow-up to that. So like when you kind of set out to write the book, what were your expectations?
Well, by then I had already done a fair bit of reporting on Africatown. I also, after the magazine piece, I also wrote a chapter for a book. It's an anthology about grassroots environmental movements. I wrote about the fight over like a tank farm that they wanted to build at the edge of Africatown about 10 years ago, and how the group MEJAC developed out of that. And originally when I wrote that, I thought I was going to be able to just repurpose my magazine story, but the way things played out, I ended up writing a whole new piece for it, which was about as long as a magazine piece. It was, I think they wanted a 2,000 word story, and then they had so many more questions. It ballooned into 4,000 or 5,000 words. So I had a lot of phone interviews for that. And then when I had the idea for the book proposal, I was already starting to work on it before the news came out that the wreckage of the ship had been identified. And so when that happened, I immediately bought a plane ticket and flew down for the celebration there. And so when I was there, that second time, I asked a lot of people, what would you think about me doing this? Because that was, you know, in terms of my expectations, this was one of the important questions, like what kind of a reception would I get? You know, would people talk to me? Would they be comfortable with me being there? And also, just from an ethical standpoint, I felt like there was no way I could do this ethically if I didn't have buy-in from people who were involved in this story, you know, whose lives were affected by it, whose ancestors had been on the ship, who had grown up in this neighborhood. So I was cagey with, especially I have to say, with white people in Mobile. In that at first I was like not quick to tell people what I was doing, but people who were connected with the story, I was quite open with them and said, I'm not really here for the magazine. I'm thinking about writing a book. What would you think about me doing this? And the response I got from almost everybody, not quite everyone, but the vast majority was like, look, we need all the help we can get. So if you're going to do a responsible job of it, then come on down. You know, we'd love to have you. So I felt like I knew what I was getting when I moved down there. And I was not expecting the lockdowns to happen. I didn't know a global pandemic was going to set in. but I have to say that if anything, it may have helped my research process, because there's a tendency sometimes for journalists to just research endlessly because the research is easier than the writing. and the lockdowns, there was only so much I could do, so much research I could do when the world was sort of shut down. And so if anything, I think that kind of pushed me to move faster on the writing portion.
It's evident that you did the research. That's throughout the book, and I do want to actually. There are some things I was going to ask you from your research, what you learned, but to continue in this pattern, when you wrote, I would suspect as a writer or as someone that composes articles, etc., and publishing your first book, who was your target audience? Who do you want to read the book, and what do you want them to learn from reading the book?
Good question. I guess I felt like the potential audience for something like this was, almost unlimited. I certainly, like, first and foremost, I was thinking about what the descendant community and the neighborhood community would think. Their opinions mattered more than anyone else's. But I thought that obviously there's a big audience for Black history. I think, like a sort of Black middle class audience is always interested in books about Black history. But also because it has this sort of maritime history dimension, like this swashbuckling thing of the last slave ship, I thought that we'd probably get a lot more readers, a lot of, like white history buffs too. And I have to say that I even felt like it could probably work for classrooms. I felt like this story gave me a way to, in a way that not many stories would do, it created an opportunity to give this sweeping overview of Black history from the slavery period all the way to the present day, like the kind of sweep that you would get in a textbook, because you can look at how all these different things that were happening at the national level sort of affected Africatown. In fact, in order to understand what happened to the neighborhood, you have to understand what was happening at the national level. At the same time, because the characters are so vivid and the story itself is just so dramatic, I felt like it would be easier for people to digest, and than a textbook would be, and like probably appealing to a bigger audience than that. So, I think about books like Eric Larson's books, like Devil in the White City or something. Those are phenomenally popular books of history that are well researched, but they're also written in this sort of novelistic style. On one level, that's what I was trying to do, and that's the kind of audience that I had in mind.
And then we're going to jump into the books next, but I'll have one more question. You are a white male telling the story of the descendants, Africatown. Some would consider you a white liberal. How has that been received from others, and how do you view kind of this white guy telling this story about the descendants in Africatown and profiting off of it?
Yeah, that's an important question. Obviously, I was self-conscious about it from the beginning. So that was why I approached a bunch of people and asked them, what would you think about me doing this? Because I'm a white journalist and I'm not even from Alabama. I had in some ways I was an unlikely person to be doing it. But since I got such a good reception, mean, I feel like, this is like there has to be an ethical way to do this. Nobody else was queuing up to do it that I could see. I think that if I had learned that some journalist of color was circling this subject, thinking about doing a book like this, if they had called me and asked for resources, asked if I could, share my sources with them or sent them documents or anything, I would have happily, helped them out and stepped out of the way. But as it was, it looked like if I didn't do it, it just wasn't going to happen. And, I mean, not many of my friends in New York, for instance, like were eager to leave the city and move down to Alabama and take all the risks that it involves. I mean, as I said, I left my job. I did have an advance from the publisher, but it was like just enough to live on while I did the research, working, often 12 or 13-hour days. And so, there weren't a lot of people queuing up to do something like that. It was a pretty huge undertaking. And so with that in mind, I went through the steps that seemed like the most ethical ones to me. First was to ask people what they thought before I committed to it. And then once I was there, I wanted to make sure it would be a book that people in this community would approve of and feel like they got something from. But I also wanted to give them something in the meantime. So I started to share research materials as I went along. Often I would find letters or photographs or old newspaper stories that related to people's grandparents or their favorite teachers in school or their pastors, or in the case of somebody like Joycelyn Davis, she was just constantly asking me questions about the history, like, what do we know about John Dabney, who owned a plantation where some of the people ended up, or I guess all of them ended up there for a little while. What do we know about Thomas Buford, another one of Mayer's associates? What do we know about King Gwele in West Africa, who sold these people to Bill Foster? And in all of those cases, I tried to give people something in the meantime while I was doing the research, to share stuff with them, just to share copies of these old newspaper stories with them, and even to let their questions and their concerns sort of shape the book. Those questions that Joycelyn was peppering me with kind of became my questions, and one of the reasons that there's so much material on King Gwele in the book is that her burning curiosity about him kind of ignited the same thing in me. So I felt like I tried to do it in the most ethical way I could. So, and I have to say that it's been well received by people in the descendant community and the Africatown community. Since the book came out, I was also, I was prepared for a lot of backlash when it came out. I was prepared to get attacked just for having done this at all as a white journalist. We did hire a sensitivity reader, a Black woman from Alabama, to read it carefully and tell us about anything that was worded in a way that was worded or portrayed in a way that was careless or potentially offensive. She didn't find much. She did have a couple of suggestions about just tweaks to make, which we were grateful for. And really the reviews have been uniformly positive, I have to say, and I haven't really gotten dragged on Twitter the way I was afraid I would be. I guess people see that I did the work and that I did it in a conscientious way. So I hope that that reception continues, knock on wood.
Let's talk about the book. You wrote the book in 3 parts. Part 1, Coast to Coast, 1859 to 1865. Part 2, Africatown, 1865 to 1935. And then Part 3, Preservation and Demolition, 1950 to 2008. As I mentioned at the start, and that was demolition. Sorry. As I mentioned at the start, is well researched. I even in conversation told you I thought some of the stories you included, this was from my own personal research, like the Eufaula story and the Spring Hill story when they went to go and kind of that time, what was taking place in 1874 when our ancestors would go vote and how bloody that particular time was, and to go vote for blacks. And so the fact that you included that in the story, as well as your detailed research on King Glahe, is evident. What I'm curious about, because I don't want to give, I want people to read the book, but what I'm curious about is what did you leave out? What's a story that, or some research that you did that didn't make the book, but something that maybe that pertains to either my ancestors or or Africatown that may not necessarily be in the book or as detailed as you wanted it in the book, but it's just a story that you could share with the audience?
Well, I felt like I did manage to fit in pretty much everything that I wanted to, but at the same time, there were a lot of moments when I wished that I were writing a book that was twice as long or longer, that where I could have gone more into, that would have let me talk about like what was going on in the city of Mobile more generally. Like I don't really get into the civil rights movement in Mobile at all, for instance. I will make a plug. There's another book on the way by this guy named Scotty Kirkland, who works for the Alabama Department of Archives and History and lived in Mobile for years. It's going to be about Mobile, race and politics in Mobile throughout the 20th century. And I think that's going to be like an amazing complement to this book. But I think a lot of the stuff that he's getting into, I would have loved to get into. I mean, I remember when I first read about the lawsuit over Michael Donald's death. You know, this is the murder that people call the last lynching. It was this young man, Michael Donald, was murdered by two guys, members of sort of what remained of the Klan in the early 80s. And Michael Figures, who shows up in the book a little bit, but not as much as I would have liked for him to. He was involved in this lawsuit that ended up bankrupting the Klan, and he gave this amazing like set of closing remarks in the trial. And when I read those closing remarks, just in the course of like reading about Mobile's racial history, I was totally emotionally overcome. And I thought, oh, I have to find a way to get this in there. But it was too ancillary to, you know, it was too far removed from the Africatown story. And I mean, there's also a theme in the book of like how history is preserved or not preserved in some cases, like how documents go missing, how physical resources, how it costs a lot of money to preserve history, and Mobile is a city that's very proud of certain aspects of its history and has invested a lot of money in preserving elements of it. But a lot of Africatown's history has been lost because even parts of it that were documented, I think, like in some cases, the documents have disappeared because the people didn't have the resources to hold on to them. Like John Smith, who was the mayor of Pritchard in the 80s, who did a lot of work to make a heritage tourism, you know, destination out of Africatown. He had all these documents in his house. He died in the mid-aughts, and I want to say it was the city of Pritchard, but it could have been city of Mobile. Like just destroyed the house, I think, like just bulldozed it, and everything that was in there is gone. And his ex-wife told me like he had a massive trove of material. And so there were a lot of stories like that that I came across, all these sort of kooky figures of like historic preservation in Mobile, and I would have liked to work some more of that stuff in too, because it does have an important bearing on this story and the ways that the understanding of the Clotilda.
Nick, are you there?
Can you hear me?
I can now. You froze for a second.
Okay.
I missed that last piece. You would have liked to have.
Yeah, I would have liked to. I would have liked to work in more of these, some more of this material about these kooky figures from the historic preservation in Mobile, and to talk maybe more about the ways that events in the city affected the ways that the past was preserved or not preserved, and the way the understanding of it has changed over time.
What? Very interesting. I'm actually now curious about what Senator Figures said in his closing. I don't want to get off topic too much, but kind of give me a synopsis of what was said in the closing.
It's been a couple years since I read that speech, so I'm going to have to look it up for you, but I'll send it to you.
Okay. I was just curious because it's
quoted in a book called The Lynching by Lawrence Leamer. I think that was where I first encountered it. I have to say, I don't think it's a very good book. It's sort of like the authorized biography of Morris Dees, the president, the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Morris Dees got into a lot of trouble a few years ago. He's no longer there. And in the book, you can see all these ways that the author sort of intentionally skirts like information that will make his main character look bad. I feel like it's kind of it's a bit dishonest with the reader, but it does. But Figures it shows up in that book quite a bit, and it quotes the closing remarks at length. So it's worth looking at just for that.
Who was Timothy Mayer?
He was a business magnate.
And we know, and I was actually asking you that question just to dig a little bit deeper because you did some research on the individual, but I guess to even elaborate, because he was more than a businessman.
Yeah,
he was very influential. He was intentional. I personally don't believe in the folklore story. I think that simplifies the sophistication of his plan.
Right.
So just digging a little bit deeper, like who was he as? Because you've done a lot of research on these characters.
I have, yeah. I think two important things to understand about Mayer. One is just his personal temperament. He was like, by all accounts, according to all evidence, he was just a jerk, like a extremely hot-tempered person. I found these reports of him. I have the book here in front of me, and I'm trying to find the page. I found these reports of him like getting into fights in the years before the Clotilda incident happened. Like in one case, he was wounded with a knife in a fight with one of his crewmates, and the newspaper that reported it said, like, our understanding of it is that the whole thing was Mayer's fault. Like he started the fight, and then he lost. Like he got cut with a knife. The other and also there's a case where reported in one of the papers where he supposedly like rammed another ship, I guess in the Delta, and it was an editorial, and the editor said, like, it's hard to believe that somebody would even do something so reckless, but if he did, then he should be scourged from the river. And so there are some clues about what kind of a person he was at that level, his personal character. But he was also quite politically active. He was a big advocate for reopening the transatlantic slave trade. This is kind of a forgotten chapter, but a lot of Southern businessmen were pushing hard to do this in the years right before the war. And Mayer was definitely one of them. he was involved in these efforts to create like a sort of southern colony in Latin America, in Nicaragua, which he wanted to see the U.S. annex, and he thought that he named one of his ships the Southern Republic, and I think that's why, because it spoke to his vision of a republic that would span North and South America, and like Mobile would have been sort of geographically at the center of it. And so it does seem to me like when he conceived of the idea to charter this ship and bring a shipload of people over to the US from West Africa, it wasn't just a profit-making venture. It was an act of political protest. The James Buchanan administration had been saying that it wanted to crack down on illegal slave voyages, and it seems like Mayer was sort of calling their bluff. And I do believe this part of the war, that what he wanted to do was show that he could get away with it, that he would say, look, I'm going to do it and you're not going to prosecute me, like I dare you. And I think he hoped that his doing it successfully would like send political reverberations, and that it would be sort of a volley in this campaign to reopen the slave trade.
From your research, was Timothy Mayer ever prosecuted?
I don't think he was. There are a couple of accounts that say he was. He said that he was. He said that he was taken to jail for a week or something, and this enslaved person named Noah, who worked for him, described this memory of him coming back to his house like a week or something after the voyage, and his wife being extremely relieved, and him saying, that he'd been in jail for all this time. Now, I will say, it's not like we have Noah's memories like written down by him personally and preserved through the generations. They were written down by this white woman named Mary McNeil Scott. And I mean, for the most part, it seems like remarkably accurate. Like everything that she quotes him saying seems to be amazingly accurate. It seems like it probably is stuff that he said. But every time we have like an intermediary like that, every time there's somebody in the middle, especially in the Jim Crow era, this is the beginning of the Jim Crow era, a white person like reporting the memories of a former slave. And this was at a time when the Clotilda story was already very well known. It was already, sort of a legend in Mobile. I always have like some degree of skepticism about whether the white reporter can really be trusted. And it's not you can imagine that in a case like that, she would have just, because she knew the story about Mayer being thrown in jail, that she would have just put it in there and said, and just kind of put it in the mouth of Noah. I don't know. But no, I mean, according to this document, Noah said that he remembered Mayer coming back after he was in jail. At the same time, like the court records that we have show Burns Mayer, Tim's brother, and Bill Foster being prosecuted, but they don't have anything about Mayer being charged. So it's a mystery to me, but if I had to guess, I would say that he was never charged.
Yeah, that's kind of been my research. I haven't seen where he was actually charged. I think people assume it based off of the other Mayer and the Foster, but I don't think that we have documented. I even went to the archives here in Atlanta and never saw his name listed as being prosecuted. Who was prosecuted? You mentioned Burns, William, and you didn't mention John, but
did not know.
Yeah.
John Dabney too was also part of that case, but Foster was a ship maker who came from Nova Scotia in Canada, and he moved to Mobile in the 1830s, I think, and he was both he both built ships and went on river voyages. He was pretty young man, you know, unmarried at the time that he undertook this voyage. I will say that the two things about this. Number one, Jim Delgado has convinced me that the Clotilda probably was built for slave voyages, because it's
built around 1955. 1855, 1856, right?
Yeah, that it was built for slave voyages before the voyage to West Africa, because there were still, because we know that there were you know, captives, there were enslaved people being transported around the West Indies, like being brought from Cuba up to ports along the Gulf Coast, to places like New Orleans, and Mobile, and the Clotilda made many voyages to port cities that had known ties to the transatlantic slave trade, and in some cases it even had like unlisted cargo, and did business with people who were known to be involved in slave trafficking. And it also was just like somehow like the perfect vessel for this voyage to West Africa. It was light, it was fast, like a Gulf schooner, but it also had this enormous hold that was like tall enough for a short person to stand up in, you know, enough space to hold 110 people. And maybe that's just a coincidence, but it was also built on Tim Mayer's shipyard. So, you know, these two guys, Foster and Mayer, had a business partnership that went back before 1860, when this voyage to West Africa happened. So I think there's a good chance that Bill Foster had some involvement in slave trafficking before he went to the city of Ouidah in West Africa.
Which to me, what you just said debunks this idea of a bet. I think that simplifies the level of sophistication, especially given what you are sharing today around even how Clotilda was built. I mean, the whole intent was built, 4 years prior to, or a few years prior to even selling off, 4 to 5 years before it sailed off, for this very reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're just, you know, taking the Occam's razor explanation, you're just thinking the simplest explanation is probably the true one, then I think that leads you to say this ship was built for slave trafficking. And I do think that, as you say, I think that undermines the idea that Mayer just kind of decided on a whim that this, you know, because of a bet, that this was something he wanted to do. I will also say that he didn't even mention a bet. In his own account of this, he said, and there's really only one account from him, he said that it was like a dare, that somebody said nobody would be crazy enough to do this, and he said, you know, au contraire, like, I'll do it. And then the idea that there was like money put on the table kind of emerged a couple of years later. But at any rate, the other interesting thing to note about Foster is that only a few months, like maybe 6 months before the Clotilda voyage to West Africa, the Clotilda killed somebody in Mobile Bay. It ran over like a skiff, a small boat that was like chained. I think it was anchored in the bay, and so it's like the captain, who was not Foster, the captain who was on the Clotilda that day, coming back from a long voyage, he, you know, yelled for them to get out of the way, but the ship didn't move, and the Clotilda just plowed over it, and there were two people on it. One of them was a white guy, and he survived, but the other person was an enslaved person named Alfred, and he was killed. And the slave owner, the person who owned Alfred, sued Captain Foster, and the records that we have suggest that Foster didn't have much to his name besides this ship that was like his principal asset. So he was probably hard up for money, and that may have played a role in him agreeing to go on this crazy mission all the way over to Ouida. We don't know. He never talked about that, but that was in the background.
And like you mentioned, so I guess 3 were prosecuted, but none. I guess only Foster was the only one that actually was fined or that we know of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that 2 of them had their charges dismissed, and then
Right.
Foster's case was continued, and then the Civil War broke out, and like they weren't even, like this was federal court, and they didn't even consider themselves part of the Union anymore. So that case was done with.
Your book focuses on Africatown. It talks about kind of these take forms and the evolution of pollution and how pollution, and even tying it back to Cujo's sons and family members dying. Just tell me one thing from that particular piece of the story that you want authors to learn about Africatown and the environmental injustices.
Yeah, good question. I guess one thing that has always struck me here is that in the early 1870s, the EPA was created, the Environmental Protection Agency under Richard Nixon. And for the first time, the federal government was saying, like, look, there have to be limits on how much pollution we're going to allow. Like, and if states aren't going to cap it, then we're going to set minimums, or well, maximums. We're going to set caps, and states can be more aggressive than that if they want, but you have to at least get in line with this like base level of regulation. And the southern states, these Dixiecrats started, they threw fits about it and said, this is a question of states' rights, which was exactly the same thing that their grandfathers had said, grandfathers, great grandfathers, whatever, had said 100 years earlier when they were trying to defend their right to own human beings. They said it's not about slavery, it's about states' rights. And in this case too, because the Jim Crow legal system shaped the geography of cities like Mobile, determined kind of what would go where, and who had political power and who owned what. All this toxic pollution in southern cities was being disproportionately concentrated in Black neighborhoods. So again, like the beneficiaries were the same. Again, the victims to a large extent were the same. And again, the rhetoric was the same. The white politicians were saying it was a question of states' rights. I thought that was a pretty uncanny thing.
I think that's important, and we only got a few more questions because we're almost at our time. So, the founding of Africatown. Who founded Africatown, and from your perspective? And I have a follow-up to that because I want to tie that to the geopolitical of the time and the impacts to your point about the environmental injustices.
Yeah, I would say that when people talked about Africatown back in the late 1800s, they meant this small settlement of the survivors, a few dozen survivors of the Clotilda voyage.
About 32 to 35, I believe.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then over time, that name just kind of fell out of use. If you talk to a lot of older people who grew up in Africatown, what we call, if they grew up in Plateau, Magazine Point, they'll say, we didn't use that name when I was a kid. And then in the 70s, Henry Williams, neighborhood activist, sort of amateur historian, started to bring it back. He said, we gotta start using this name again and think of ourselves as a as one unit. You know, all these little neighborhoods: Magazine Point, Plateau, Happy Hill,
Happy Hill. Mm-hmm.
and so so now Africatown is larger than that original settlement.
That's interesting. So say that again, the evolution, because I think that's important that you share. So those 32, 35 started using that term, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, journalists would use it. It was a curiosity to them. They were like, "Look at this African village! Like all these people directly from West Africa who still speak African languages." They, you know, so Africatown.
And that was at that time referring to those 32 to 35 descendants that were collectively living together and supporting each other.
Right. Yes. And there were other people, other Black people in this area surrounding them. People, I think probably others who worked for the mayors. We don't know much about this from the records, but there is an oral history about this, saying that there had always, you know, there were people who had already lived there. There were people who came after the war, and it was always, I think it was always to some degree a melting pot. Obviously had a distinct sense of their own identity.
Okay, it was a melting pot. And then you said that the term stopped being used for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
When did they stop using? Do you know around about when the term was stopped kind of being used and re-picked back up?
It's a good question. You know, the writer Albert Murray grew up in Africatown. He was born in Magazine Point. He was born in like 1918. And in his novels, he refers to an area called African Hill. And that leads me to believe that when he was a kid, and because he changes the names of a lot of things, like Magazine Point becomes Gasoline Point. So African Hill was probably, you know, Africatown. So that leads me to believe that in the 1920s and 30s, when he was growing up, the name was still in use. You know, Cudjoe was still alive until 1935. So it's easy to imagine that name still would have been used.
Gotcha. Geopolitical at the time then, and I know we're at time, so I got a few more questions. So geopolitically, your book kind of talks about this, but it was intentional for that area of Africatown to be essentially, there wasn't plumbing, the pollution and the decisions that were being made. Who was making those decisions at the time?
Well, it was impossible.
And how were they being made?
Right. It was impossible for Black people to get elected in Mobile city government. When they created a city commission in the early 1900s, they decided that it would be based on, the elections would be at large, not based on neighborhood or district. And as long as there was like at least a 51% majority of
Nick? There you go. You're back. So you said that it was at least a 51% majority.
Yeah. So as long as there was like a slight majority of white people, they would be able to get, of white voters, they would be able to get all of the city commissioners could be, you know, they would reliably elect white politicians. They also, because of the Jim Crow laws, Black people for the most part had been stripped of their voting rights anyway. And on top of all of that, the city had decided not to include Plateau, Magazine Point, all these areas in the city limits. They could have annexed them, but they decided not to. And so all of those things were factors. It wasn't until the neighborhood was annexed in the 50s and 60s, and that happened in a few different stages, that they finally got plumbing and sewers and electricity.
Which also played a major role in the health crisis and the health concerns that people of Africatown, and kind of circling back to your first day arriving, this kind of all plays a role and continues to play a role. Just so we can wrap up,
Mhm.
how do you want your work viewed? And I should have asked you this earlier, real quickly. Just this is just an aside, but I was extremely interested in Thaddeus Stevens.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah, can you just educate the audience really quickly on who Thaddeus Stevens was and his relevance to this particular story?
Yeah, it's a hobby horse for me because I love Thaddeus Stevens. He was a legislator from New England. He was one of the radical Republicans at a time when the Republicans were the abolitionist party, and they and he wanted the federal government to be really hard on the South after the Civil War and kind of consolidate the gains that the Union had made and make conditions better for Black people. And he said in a speech right after the war in Pennsylvania, he said, what we ought to do is seize all of the plantations of like the 1%, of Southerners, and break them up and give all the land to the Black people. And he said this will accomplish two things. It'll both strip those white Southern aristocrats of their power, and it will create this broad class of Black, independent farmers. And obviously that didn't happen. But when he died, and W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this in Black Reconstruction, when he died, he insisted that he be buried in a Black cemetery because he was so he was so, what's the word? He was so like morally indignant about segregation that one way or another, like that racial barrier was going to break down for him, in his burial place. And if Black people couldn't be buried in a white cemetery, then he was going to go the other way.
So that 1%, he wanted to give that back to the enslaved folk.
That's right.
Do you think that justice for those 110 enslaved Africans and their descendants has been resolved? Do you think?
No, absolutely not. I mean, not only was nobody prosecuted, but I don't know how do you make something like that right? I always go back to the epigraph of the book, which is from this writer Saidiya Hartman. I just love this line, and I've read it a million times, but it still makes me emotional to read it, where she says, the demands of the slave on the present have everything to do with making good the promise of abolition, and this entails much more than the end of property in slaves. It requires the reconstruction of society, which is the only way to honor our debt to the dead. This is the intimacy with our age, of our age with theirs, an unfinished struggle. To what end does one conjure the ghosts of slavery, if not to incite the hopes of transforming the present? So that's where I think this sort of, that's how we have to think about justice. Like we have to think about, we can't, they suffered, endlessly. We can't change that, but we can make a more just society. And I think that's the best way to honor their memory.
What would justice look like? As a white male that's covered this story, you're ingrained in it. You probably know more about this story than a number of descendants and people. From your perspective, what would justice look like?
I think it would mean, for one thing, using this story to maybe transform the way that people think about race in this country. I feel like this story is really it can be so eye-opening for the rest of America. I also think that, we can talk about reparations on different levels. I think that it's worth thinking about not just reparations for slavery itself, but for all the ways that Black people have been deprived of wealth, since the antebellum era, since the Civil War. In this particular case, it certainly involves, getting the pollution out of Africatown, and And I think, I mean, this place is such a glorious, like, living monument to the memory of those people. I think we have to take measures to preserve it, to like renew its economy, and yeah, I think using it as a destination for people to come and learn about Black history is very appropriate. I think that's kind of a win-win.
What do you want to leave this audience with?
Well,
well, first off, before you even say that, do you
Yeah.
have any questions for me?
Well, I don't know how much time we have left. I gather that it's tight, but what does justice look like from your perspective?
That's a very good question. I think that for me, justice includes reparations. I think you hit on it, where reparations is more than just handing out paychecks. However, I do believe that that is a piece of the story, right? But I think it first starts off with holding those that were conspirators in the crime that was committed accountable. So I think from a history perspective that Timothy Mayer, Captain Foster, all co-conspirators, even the involvement of the U.S. federal government at the time, need to be held accountable. I think for history's sake, I think that that's important for it to be documented. But then the reparations is a piece of it, the actual dollars. But when you talk about reparations, there's an educational piece, there's a environmental piece, there's a economic piece. There are a number of different arms, which is why I'm under the belief that a task force needs to be formed that can really identify all of the psychological areas and all of the areas that apply. And I think that we need to work towards this, whatever that task force identifies. That's what we should work towards. I've lost confidence that this can happen at the federal level. I don't think that at a federal level, they're going to pass any sort of legislation, HR 40. I'm hopeful, but just the progress of it has been extremely slow. So I'm not sure if we'll have a federal kind of piece to this. So we may have to look at a state level or some sort of local level, but I think a task force needs to be put in place to identify the appropriate, and this task force has to include, experts in the financial space, experts in the educational space, Black experts in agriculture, psychology, education. Like, these need to be experts in all of those areas coming together to put together what the appropriate reparation plan is. So for me, it's holding those accountable, rewriting history, and then addressing this reparations piece. Did that answer your question?
It did answer my question. Yeah. I feel like California is creating a template. They started with a task force, and we'll see where all that goes.
Yeah, we'll see where it goes. I think California started. I think Atlanta has a task force. I actually think the story of the 110 and my ancestors is really the best case scenario, really the best case study for reparations, to be honest with you. And my hope is that your book helps to showcase and bring awareness to the injustices, but also be an advocate that this is the best case study. Like, look at what has happened and what continues to happen even today. So I think this book is a perfect book to help make the case that this is the best case study for the reparations conversation.
Thanks, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, the story itself really does demonstrate demonstrates all the things that have happened since the Civil War, for people who imagine that this conversation is just about slavery. I feel like if you take a close look at, at this story, it really, as I said, can really be eye-opening. So yeah, I hope that it will have that effect.
Yeah. Any more questions for me?
No, I think that about covers it.
No, that's good. I appreciate it. And anything you want to leave the audience with? Anything you want to kind of share with this audience? Definitely go out and buy the book. I think you do an excellent job, as I mentioned. You even talk about the Black codes, which was fascinating. We didn't touch on that. We didn't touch on the Black codes and Reconstruction. You do a great job of highlighting the historical timeline of the environmental injustices. I mean, your research into what my ancestors experienced in the Barracoon is unlike any other that I've read, very detailed and encryptive. And I know we didn't touch on those things, but I didn't touch on them intentionally because you have a number of interviews that you've done where you talk about those things. And if people are interested in what's in the book, you can either go look at those interviews or you can read the book. And I know we got to wrap up. So
getting my power outlet or my power supply.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, people can go and look at the interviews and you talk about those things. You talk about Reconstruction, the Black codes. You talk about the environmental injustices and all of those things in other interviews. But go read the book if you are interested in the detail. I specifically wanted to have a different approach to this interview. Hopefully, it was different for you. Hopefully it wasn't the same traditional, let's talk about this and let's talk about that. So hopefully it was a little bit challenging as well. So that was my intent. So
yeah, well done.
I encourage everybody to go get the book. But what do you want to leave the audience with?
Well, I mean, I do think that people should try to get involved. And if they want to do that, even if it's just by sending a contribution or something, the kind of clearinghouse for this sort of thing, the easiest place to tell everybody to go is descendantfilm.com. Obviously, this is created by the team that made the Netflix documentary Descendant. They have information on this website about various groups that are involved with the Africatown story and the Descendants, and they've done a better job than. I mean, there was no reason for my publisher and me to sort of reinvent the wheel. They've created an excellent hub for people to go to if they want to do something besides just reading the book and seeing the movie. So descendantfilm.com.
Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you all for joining this conversation with Nick Tabor. He has done an excellent piece. Africatown is the name of the book, available on Amazon and hopefully at your local bookstore. And so thank you all for joining. And I look forward to you all joining us again. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.